It is my absolute pleasure to open this session that is titled Envisioning Middle East Peace, Are Rights Still Relevant? And before starting, I just would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I recognize their continuing custodianship and connection to lands, waters, and communities, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. The idea of custodianship is at its heart an idea of care. It reflects connection to natural entities that transcends legal borders or the legal recognition of sovereignty. And by acknowledging country, I also acknowledge the limitations of formal legal institutions and hope that our discussions here today will also acknowledge the existence of alternatives that reflect creative thinking about borders, sovereignty, and connection to natural spaces. So today we have two phenomenal speakers that I personally love and value dearly. Professor Omar Dajani will discuss pathways to peace in the Middle East amidst escalating violence, weakening of the global order, and inadequate legal interventions. And at a time when it becomes clearer than ever that the traditional two-state solution is at an impasse and also inadequate, and that the one-state solution presents significant challenges, Professor Dajani will explore the potential of a shared homeland paradigm for Palestine-Israel, sharing a vision for a positive pathway forward. Dr. Michelle Lesh will then provide her insights in response to Professor Dajani's presentation, opening up a constructive dialogue about visions for peace in Palestine-Israel. So I'll present our speakers briefly, but you have their full bios are accessible on our website. So Omar Dajani is the Carol Olson Professor of International Law at the McGeorge School of Law and the University of the Pacific. And you know what, I'll just, instead of reading out the formalities, I'll just say that I've known Omar for many years now. We met in the US when I was still a PhD student, and I've always found his devotion and dedication and visionary on solutions for the Middle East conflict truly inspiring. I've always learned much from listening to Omar's view, and he brings a lot of experience, both as an academic, but also as a practitioner working on various aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then similarly, Michelle, who teaches at Melbourne Law School and also taught at the London School of Economics, brings beyond her academic scholarship and expertise also a view from a practitioner's perspective, working in several roles at the United Nations, including on issues around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So both of them bring significant experience, both from a practical and academic perspectives, and I'm very happy that both agreed to be here today and to discuss some creative visions for the Israel-Palestine conflict at a time where ethnic cleansing seemed to be on the rise as a legitimate solution for the area. Thank you. Omar, let's start with you.
Thanks so much, Shiri. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to Shiri for inviting me to Deakin and to Australia on what's been my first visit this week. What I have learned is that her extraordinary integrity, unsurprisingly, is complemented by an equally extraordinary sense of hospitality. And so thank you so much to you and to Dean McMahon for facilitating all of this, and to all of you for joining us today. I would like to present a alternative vision for the future of Israel-Palestine, and to speak a little bit about a scholarly agenda that has a little bit of an activist tilt to it that's proceeding from that vision, and to end a little bit by turning to the title of the talk for today, which is a question about whether rights remain relevant to the resolution of the conflict, the transformation of the situation in Israel-Palestine. But the place I'd like to start is with your own foreign minister. I had occasion to meet Penny Wong in September. I was in New York for the General Assembly, and the International Peace Institute, which is a think tank that's attached to the United Nations in a range of ways and does a lot of convening around peace-building initiatives, hosted its annual dinner of foreign ministers from the Arab world and from an array of other states, mainly Europeans and Australia, and your foreign minister too. And we had occasion to present some of what I'll be presenting to you today there. And in the few days that followed, Foreign Minister Wong appeared at a meeting of a coalition that's been established by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, by the Norwegians, and by the European Union, a coalition that is animated by a desire in its name to implement the two-state solution. And at the meeting of that coalition, she said that Australia remains committed to a two-state solution as a means of resolving the conflict in Israel-Palestine, and also entertains the idea that recognition of a state of Palestine could be, rather than the culmination of that process, potentially a step towards it. I, over the course of those days, heard similarly well-meaning expressions of commitment to a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine. But behind closed doors, in conversations with government officials, in conversations with think tanks, analysts, think tank analysts working on the Middle East, and honestly, in conversations with practically every Palestinian and Israeli I talked to, no one, and I mean no one, believes that the kind of two-state solution that has long been envisaged remains feasible in this moment. And so I'd like to speak a little bit about why there is this prevailing sense, and why beyond the challenges to its feasibility, there are also real challenges to its desirability, before turning to speak about what I think is a viable alternative, a two-state solution that can work, and speaking about the work that we need to do to make that a reality, both as scholars and as the international community. So why is the two-state solution, as it's long been imagined, so difficult to imagine implementing? So the straightforward answer, and the one that I think is at the front of mind for a lot of folks who work in policy, is fairly easy. Settlements. People look at the transformations on the ground over the last 30 years. And what they see is that as of 1999, 2000, the point at which when I was working as a legal advisor to the PLO in peace talks with Israel, in what ultimately failed to deliver a peace agreement, at that juncture, there were around 300,000 Israelis in settlements in the West Bank. At that moment, that number was already an incredible hurdle to achieving a peace premised on separation. And let me dwell for a moment on this idea of separation, because that idea, as I mentioned in my talk the other day, guided so much of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking over the last 25 years. It was an idea that said that peace is best achieved not only through partition, that is to say, by drawing a border through Israel-Palestine, but also through ethnic separation, by maximizing the degree of physical separation between Israeli Jews on the one hand and Palestinians on the other. And so pursuant to that, with regard to the issue of settlements, the answers that were offered up to address the proliferation of settlements in the West Bank really focused on how you separate. So either these hundreds of thousands of settlers would be annexed to Israel, i.e. the border would be redrawn in a way that placed their settlements inside the state of Israel, or for the settlements that were outside this revised border, those Israeli Jews would be relocated or evacuated from their homes and obliged forcibly to return to Israel. In those days, the number that we were talking about having to be relocated was about 88,000 people. And in the years after our failure to reach a peace deal, when Israel forcibly relocated 6,000 Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip, the tumult and trauma at the national level that attended that exercise convinced a lot of people that relocating some 90,000, 88,000, 90,000 Israelis from the West Bank was going to be infeasible. We've arrived at a point today where that number, the total number of settlers in the West Bank has grown to around 700,000. Some say 750,000, where according to most recent estimates, the number outside of the large blocks of settlements that Israel has long sought to annex is around 150,000. So what we're faced with is an enterprise that has really significant costs with regard to security, in terms of economics, in view of the compensation that's previously been paid, and also in terms of politics. There is a recognition among Israeli leaders, even those not on the right, that relocating that number of settlers would create political circumstances that would push the country even further to the right. And it's already pretty far to the right. Having said all of that, it's important to bear a few other things in mind. Number one, that separation also presented other really significant problems. The first is a moral one, and it's one that is rooted in the experience of the creation of nation states in the 20th century, where partition was attended by separation. What very often followed was not only bloody conflict, but very often, whether we're talking about Greece and Turkey, whether we're talking about the Indian subcontinent, and there are a range of other examples one can point to, ethnic cleansing very often followed, so that attempts to revise borders led to far broader dislocation than was initially anticipated. But even beyond that, there is a challenge in Israel-Palestine. And that challenge is that for both Palestinians and for Israeli Jews, the entire unit, the entire length and breadth of that land is cherished by us, is honored by us as a homeland. And so, like many other Palestinians, I have a necklace with an image of the place that my family comes from. And it's not the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It is the entire land that we're talking about, because the entire land is both Palestine and Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And for Palestinians, that means the places from which we fled, many of us as refugees, Jaffa, Haifa, are now inside the state of Israel. And for many Israeli Jews, the places that are revered in biblical tradition as having been the sites of the ancient Hebrew kingdoms are in what we now call the West Bank, and they call Judea and Samaria. And so unscrambling the egg on that front is particularly challenging because of these links of attachment. But there's an even more formidable challenge that is presented. In a space that is just a little bit larger than the state of Vermont in the US, I'm not sure what the analog would be in Australia, we have present 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinians. And we live close to each other in every single part of the land, within kilometers and sometimes within meters. We share the same hospitals, particularly inside Israel, the same highways and roads. And in many places, our homes are a mere stone's throw, sometimes too literally, from each other. And so that means that with regard to a set of questions ranging from how you manage climate change adaptation, to how you deal with transportation, to how you deal with public health, a framework that centers the idea of separation is truly untenable. And so what's the answer? In circumstances where you have an international community again and again reaffirming its faith in a solution that not only over 3 rounds of negotiations we haven't been able to reach agreement on, but which, when you look closely at the ground, is an approach that does violence to the way that people actually live. How do we respond to such a scenario? So in the current moment, we see one response being set forward, and it's a path that is being blazed with the strong advocacy of some members of Israel's governing coalition, and apparently with the perhaps half-hearted but nevertheless explicit support of the President of the United States. And it's a path that is built on the idea that there is a military solution to our conflict, and that vanquishing and expelling people from the land is the answer to the fact that we've got 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israelis living together alongside it. We've already seen that it is an approach that is soaked in blood, but what we have seen when one takes a step back and looks at the last 75 years of history in this space is that it's also an approach that simply hasn't worked. Palestinians have already lived one experience of being pushed out of their homeland. And the creation of refugee problems in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan has not been a recipe for stability. To the contrary, it's been a source of quite the opposite. So with all of this gloom, I want to sketch an alternative and also to talk a bit about how an alternative that feels so remote from the present reality can become a more realistic prospect. And so, first of all, I want to acknowledge, and perhaps in our discussion, we can turn to one alternative that is being advocated by a lot of people, including many Palestinians, which is the idea of Israel-Palestine being consolidated into a single state, either a liberal state built around a secular democratic model, or a binational state in which there are some communal rights. And while I think that there is a lot to commend that kind of vision, and while it may be something in the future that we could consent to coming together to form, I confess that it's very difficult for me to imagine Israelis and Palestinians at this juncture forging the kind of common national identity, and even more importantly, dispensing with their respective national identities in ways that would make that kind of vision the next step in our journey together. I'm happy to talk more about the issues with that later on. But what I'm here to advocate today is a different kind of two-state solution. And so what we are pressing for is a two-state solution, one in which a Palestinian state is established alongside Israel, in which a border is delimited between the two states, and in which that border is based upon the line that has become the international consensus, and that has been an international consensus position since at least 2005 and arguably 1999 or 2000, which is the June 4th, 1967 line, or the 1949 armistice line. They're the same thing, but are referred to differently. And that line has created expectations and is a source of legitimacy, which is why it has to remain a reference point. The question is, how do you have such a line in view of the settlements, in view of the attachments that I pointed to earlier? And as I described on Monday in another talk, what we embrace is a framework built on two foundations. One of those foundations is individual and collective equality as expressed through national partnership. And so what we envisage is a confederal framework that brings these two states, Israel and Palestine, together in some respects, where a mix of shared institutions and cooperative institutions address matters of common concern, and where some of those shared institutions also address questions of individual rights and ensure that within each of the states, constitutional changes that are enacted pursuant to peace actually are implemented and can be relied upon. But the other foundation of this is a commitment to freedom of movement and residence, so that over time, with due attention to the need for slow implementation with regard to security and economy issues as they affect the lives of both Palestinians and Israelis, freedom of movement and residence would be implemented so that any Palestinian could come, return and become a citizen of the state of Palestine, but become a permanent resident of the state of Israel. Conversely, an Israeli national, including Israeli settlers, could become permanent residents of the state of Palestine while remaining citizens of the state of Israel. We anticipate that this provides integrative solutions to the issues of settlements and refugees, and to the challenge presented by mixed cities like Jerusalem, in which Palestinians and Israelis live together. And we also think that this provides a far better way of addressing some of the kinds of issues that I gestured to earlier: public health, climate change, managing transportation and tourism, and of course the billion-dollar question, which is managing security in a space that small. So This agenda can seem utopian at first glance, and I'd like to just say a couple of things about that. And I realize, do I have 5 minutes left or something like that? Okay, all right, great. So it can seem utopian at first glance, but there are a few things that I think it's important to stress before turning to talking about the research agenda that I think that it points us towards. The first thing is that every alternative to the status quo seems unrealistic. And one of the things that we have to grapple with is the fact that moving in any direction will be incredibly challenging. And moving in any direction will require the international community, as well as Palestinians and Israelis, to do things differently. The second thing that I want to stress is that we are in a moment right now, not only of incredible darkness and despair as the horror unfolding in both the Gaza Strip and now increasingly as in the West Bank attests, and as the lingering trauma among Israeli Jews following October 7th attests. But there is also an unusual opportunity presented with right now. As a result of the increasing thaw in relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, as a result of the decimation of Hezbollah's capacity to serve as a proxy in support of Iran, and to not only push back on attempts to confront Iran by Israel, but also attempts to place additional pressure on Iran's other allies in the region. And thirdly, as a result of the extraordinary transformation in Syria, a location where, for the moment at least, we see this thaw between Iran and Saudi Arabia reflected in a lack of a proxy war. I'm hoping that that doesn't shift, and there are a lot of things that could move us in a different direction. But if there's another proxy war, it's not going to be between those two powers. Why is that an opportunity? It's an opportunity because we are talking about a region where some of the leading states, and in particular the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is very focused on stability as the most crucial value for it to press. And stability is the centerpiece of the kingdom's approach to internal transformation, politically and economically. They are invested in the most literal sense in ensuring that the region does not move even further down the path of conflict. And I know from meetings with the Saudis that they are equally invested in normalizing their relations with Iran as with normalizing their relations with Israel. To their minds, those two portfolios are so fundamentally linked that they have the same person leading the Foreign Affairs Department task force on both. They understand them to be linked in part because they see addressing the situation in Palestine as the key to both. And there's one last element of this picture that is important, which is that when you look at polling among Israeli Jews, what you find is that although there has been a cataclysmic fall in support for a two-state solution, from around 60% 10 years ago to now around 30-something%, when Israeli Jews are asked if they would support a two-state solution accompanied by a regional security framework, their support doubles. And that, to me, points to the fact that Israeli Jews, even in this moment, have not fully embraced the vision of eternal warfare that has been the hallmark of the Netanyahu era, and indeed the major commitment of some of his predecessors like Ariel Sharon. So we feel that there is a political moment, and what we are in the process of undertaking to do right now is to engage in a far-reaching research set of research projects, research enterprise, as a way of drawing on comparative expertise, comparative experience, as well as the learned experience in Israel-Palestine, to really buoy, to support the vision that we are laying out with the kind of policy depth that we think will be crucial to make it credible as we turn to policymakers in a range of places to try to get some pressure and support. And so in light of the amount of time, I'll just be very quick in mentioning a few of these projects, and then I'll conclude. And so there is a project that I'm co-leading between my university and University College London with Chaim Yacobi, who's an urban planner at UCL, in which what we are exploring is how citizenship, residency, and mobility, how the transformation of urban areas, and how transnational cooperation through confederal institutions would actually operate in a shared homeland paradigm, the kind of scheme that I've just mentioned. Simultaneously, there is a project underway at the Van Leer Institute of Jerusalem, in which Limor Yehuda and Asaf David, along with a couple of Palestinian members of our Land for All's board, are undertaking to look at what security arrangements would look like within the framework of a regime of freedom of movement and residence. And we're beginning a partnership with the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace and with the International Peace Institute as a way of exploring the kinds of governance transformations that have to occur inside Palestine and inside Israel in order to make all of this a reality. And so all of this is something I'd love to talk further with you about, but it's a long way of saying that what we see this as is not only a political opportunity, but an opportunity for those of us in academia and in broader policy communities to really try to learn lessons that are too hard-earned to ignore from the past 30 years of experience, not just in Israel-Palestine, but also in other parts of the world. And to the extent that anyone involved in this call and session has an interest in getting engaged, we would really welcome your involvement. And there are a lot of different ways in which your expertise and energy could be valued. The place I'd like to stop is returning to the title of the talk for today, Are Rights Still Relevant? In a moment like this one, it can feel as though the language of international law couldn't be more remote from questions of how to solve the difficult, and they are actually difficult as much as some folks would suggest they're not, the difficult issues on the table between Israel and Palestinians. And conversely, there are some folks who would say that an approach like ours, one that anticipates settlements remaining in place, that conceives of Palestinians' right of return as being, in some respects, compromised, contingent on Israeli consent to a framework of permanent residence. And more broadly, that requires both states to move in tandem down a path toward mutual self-determination rather than privileging one people's rights over another based upon analysis of the origins of those rights. So from both directions, I think there are critiques of the approach that we are taking. But I would end by saying that I think what more than anything commends the approach that we are taking is that it provides a framework within which a conversation about both rights and needs and interests of these two peoples whose fates are inextricably intertwined can occur, recognizing that the moment, recognizing that that conversation is not one that happens only in the context of a conflict resolution process, but that can happen over decades if it's framed by the right institutional framework. And what we're trying to do is create the kind of institutional framework that allows that multi-decade conversation to unfold and to hopefully yield justice and security for both peoples. So I'm sorry I went on at such length. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Omar. Michelle?
Thanks. Thank you, Omar. I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Rwandese people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders, present, past, and emerging. I also want to thank Shiri, Krebs, and the Centre for Law as Protection and Alfred Deakin Institute for inviting me here to join this seminar. And it really is an honour to hear Professor Omar Dajani speak so compellingly and also with such integrity about this important proposal. And Professor Dajani, your vision and that of A Land for All, the organisation of which you are the co-chair, it's a vision that you've articulated powerfully in your talk today, and it offers a political solution around the framework of the idea of mutual recognition. So recognition that the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is a shared homeland for Jewish Israelis and for Palestinians. And you propose two sovereign states, each with their own government, but with joint mechanisms and institutions for shared concerns. You've approached the unavoidable shared space reality where two people remain attached to their distinct right to self-determination, something that you referred to in your talk as links of attachment. And you also referred to your solution as a integrative one. I would say it's a very novel way that you've creatively allowed citizenship and residency to coexist through space. And in your talk and also in your recent article in Foreign Affairs, which I urge all of you to read, you described it as an Israeli-Palestinian confederation built on principles of equality and partnership. And in your talk today and also
You're right again.
You outline the main principles and key features of A Land for All. And really, these are difficult to dispute. It would so obviously be a good thing if they became reality. Predictably, many will say it's unrealistic, but you argue convincingly, even with recent examples to do with our own foreign minister, that the kind of two-state solution that's been on offer for many years and to which most Western leaders are publicly committed to, though many appear to be privately sceptical, is now defunct or not feasible, as you outlined for us. The changed conditions on the West Bank and of the character of the IDF over the last 10 years or so would suggest that, and again, this is something that you raised as well, if most of the settlers were required to leave for the sake of a viable Palestinian state, there would be civil war. And the other proposal on offer, a one-state solution, I would say I'm less optimistic than you are, and I think it has less chance of acceptance by Israel than a confederation. Indeed, the chance is probably zero. I also think Israel will continue to exist in more or less its current form for the foreseeable future. The Palestinians will achieve nothing without Israel's consent. There's no alternative, therefore, but to try and convince Israelis and Palestinians of the overwhelming merit of your proposal and to support grassroots organisations who will work for it. The current reality is intolerable, and just when you think it can't get worse, it does. Many commentators say there are two nations, no one is going anywhere. The terrible truth, however, is that Israel has hoped, and President Trump has encouraged the hope that the Palestinians will be going relatively soon. Now, the website for A Land for All, on its landing page, it acknowledges the pain of the last 16 months and it links that pain to opportunity. And I just want to read to you an excerpt of what is on that landing page. It says, "We are experiencing a moment full of pain which carries an opportunity for change. We must not miss it. This is the moment to expand our influence so we can cry out, demand and promote a political solution that will bring a safe, equal and better life for all in a land for all. Israelis and Palestinians are now living through their darkest times in their shared history on this land. However, despite all the grief, anger and pain, we, a group of Israelis and Palestinians, remain faithful to our joint journey for our future and the future of our children." And I feel that this really sets the tone, and one that was echoed by Omar in his talk, and it captures the vision of the organisation. And this is important and refreshing in this climate where polarisation, anger and insularity often unwittingly eclipse empathy and openness. Post-October 7 and the ongoing war in Gaza, the core issues in mainstream debate seem to revolve around trust and security. And again, this is something that Omar referred to in his talk. A Land for All challenges the assumptions by viewing security holistically, beyond the narrow military lens, and linking it to trust rather than seeing them as oppositional forces. There are, however, some serious obstacles which I'd like to explore, but not in any way with the view of suggesting that they're insurmountable. So I think, unlike any other conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, except perhaps in 1948, October 7 and Israel's response to it has changed the world. The very nature of Israeli society has changed. It has become almost a case study in the transformation that a society undergoes when what has been politically undiscussable and morally unthinkable become discussable and thinkable, even on primetime television. That happened in considerable part because Israeli political and military leaders made it so. It was also enabled by the fact that the trauma caused by the horrors of October 7, worsened by the realisation that the IDF and intelligence agencies could not prevent them, has become self-perpetuating as Israelis appear to relive it over and over again on an almost daily basis. All discussion presupposes a degree of common understanding if participants are not to pass each other by. But what counts in Israel now as a common understanding has radically changed, and so therefore have the possibilities of conversation, of what is open and what is closed in them. So my question, therefore, Omar, is how much do you think that affects prospects of the kind you hope for? Now, we have some indication from the results of a Palestinian-Israeli Pulse joint poll that was conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy Survey Research and the International Program in Conflict Resolution and Mediation at Tel Aviv University, which found in July 2024 that there had been a decline in the number of Israelis that support a two-state confederation. It was 20% down from 29% in 2022. Now, Omar did offer some more uplifting statistics, but my question goes further. How much do you think can be achieved unless there is a serious moral reckoning within Israel about what that society has become, not just because of what it has done and what its citizens have supported, but also because of the way its citizens talk about Palestinians and what is permissible to do to them? And there are parallel questions about Gazans and Palestinian society more generally. Again, the results of the same 2024 joint poll can give us some indication. It found that amongst Palestinians, including some polled in Gaza, support for a two-state confederation had actually increased from 22% to 35%. And if we zoom in on Gazan society more specifically, how extensive is the hatred? And a different question is, how deep does it go? They've suffered horrific and devastating loss. What is their attitude to that loss? Are they filled with as much hatred for Hamas as for Israel? Or do they feel that the loss is something that they can accept for the political success that they believe Hamas has achieved? Do they believe there was any other alternative? Now, A Land for All speaks out against, and I'm quoting here, the illusion that victory means defeat for the other side. And it argues, and again I'm quoting, military actions that are not accompanied by a long-term political strategy and the pursuit of a political solution have not succeeded in the past and will not lead to change this time either. Now, I think from one perspective, this is actually played out in the current war. A stated war aim of the Israeli government following October 7 was to destroy Hamas. And we know from the past that this is an unachievable aim. Senior commanders in the IDF warned many times that it was unachievable. It is reported that Hamas has recruited as many fighters as it has lost. And it is also unachievable because of the idiosyncrasies of Hamas as an organization, and its rise demonstrate this, as does the trajectory of asymmetrical wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. Phase 1 of the current ceasefire and the return of hostages by Hamas further confirms this. However, from the perspective of Hamas, October 7 has been a success. It attacked Israel in a way that it knew would cause greater suffering to Gazans than any previous conflicts. It knew Israel would respond ferociously, even if it did not anticipate the scale of it. Hamas's ideology is that people ought to be prepared to sacrifice themselves for an eventual victory against Israel. How do you think most Gazans feel about this? To what degree are they prepared to accept much death and destruction for a victory, even if it's a realistic path to victory that is not in any other way achievable? October 7 and Israel's response have changed the world in the West, but more significantly in the global South. Pankaj Mishra has written, Gaza has become for countless powerless people the essential condition of political and ethical consciousness in the 21st century, just as the First World War was for a generation in the West. If that is true, and it seems to be, how could Hamas and probably Gazan civilians not regard October 7 as a success, even in the case of civilians, only to console and possibly redeem their terrible suffering? And I'm particularly interested in this in relation to your work, because I wonder whether you think it might make a difference to how amenable Palestinians are to talking as opposed to fighting again. Now, I also want to talk a bit about the title of this talk, which Omar also referred to, and the subtitle is "Are Rights Still Relevant?" And this refers, and again, Omar discussed this in a bit of detail, the processes about implementing reform, how it actually happens. And your initiative is to create a framework that allows for members of both nations to travel and live throughout a shared homeland without undermining their right to self-determination and their ability to exercise that right. And this arrangement is based on rights relating to individual and collective equality and to freedom of movement. And this is all accurate and fitting, but something has changed, and Omar himself has acknowledged this, that international law has been radically undermined. Many commentators and even leaders in countries have noted with trepidation that President Trump has no regard for law, neither domestically or internationally. He cares only about power. His recent announcement of his plan for Gaza was an explicit statement that international law means nothing to him. Netanyahu sat beaming beside him. Israel has contravened international law many times, but it always claims to abide by it. Trump makes no pretense. We've seen the same with his entirely unembarrassed support for Putin. A couple of days ago, the US vetoed with Russia, North Korea, and Iran against a UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. And in your article in Foreign Affairs, you suggest that there may be a need for what you call an international transitional administration with authority over the West Bank and Gaza as a way to facilitate the transfer of power from the Israeli army to Palestinian governmental institutions, and that this administration would be mandated by the Security Council. And a Land for All security proposal also includes security cooperation, whereby if the two countries agree, joint Israeli-Palestinian forces will be deployed along the perimeter of the two countries, alongside international forces. Trump is a wild card. Europe is reeling from Trump, Vance, and Musk. The global South is unified in its sense that Israel is the pariah state, the focus of their struggle against colonialism and white supremacy. Meanwhile, Trump, Vance, and Musk have mounted a transnational culture war against just those concepts, colonialism and white supremacy. A war they describe as a reassertion of Western civilization. Netanyahu previously described the war on Gaza as being fought to save Western civilization. So do you think that an international presence is therefore possible in this fragmentation? And more generally on this concern about the decline of international law, we seem to be living, or in all likelihood will soon be living in, a world in which no one is waiting with bated breath for the judgments of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Israel is passing bills to destroy human rights organizations. So what will you do to gain acceptance for radical proposals for two sovereign states when many of the concepts that are intertwined with that concept of sovereignty and respect for it since World War II are falling apart? And now I want to talk a little bit about something that you refer to, which is an important concept, which you call the transitional period. And today you refer to it as slow implementation. And you discuss the need for this, that certain things will be implemented gradually by consent, because these kinds of things take time. And A Land for All has stated that recognition of a shared homeland is a fundamental basis for reconciliation between two peoples. So do you envisage truth-telling and reconciliation as important parts of this transitional period? Are you modeling this on the model in South Africa or Northern Ireland? Or given the absence of a common understanding and the very deep resistance by both Israelis and Palestinians to a moral reckoning about the wrongs that they have committed, should truth-telling and reconciliation be postponed in favour of more practical concerns? But are these false alternatives? Perhaps truth-telling and an honest moral reckoning are an indisputable part of what we should regard as practical, for only then will there be agreements that last. To illustrate this point more concretely, one of the main differences between your approach and the two-state solution is that there will be an institutional framework built on equality and interdependence, which includes joint judicial institutions. Do you foresee the joint judicial institutions as a forum where reconciliation and truth-telling predominantly occur, which is many years down the track? Or will it be accompanied by more ad hoc and creative forms of truth-telling and reconciliation during the transitional period and as an instrument to facilitate transition? October 7 and Israel's response have made it an imperative, morally, legally, and politically, to ensure that such terrible events do not happen again. By the same token, those events and Trump's politics, amoral and lawless, have made moral and legal reckonings and any political outcome that depends on them unlikely. That said, we have no alternative but to fight for the only proposal, your proposal, that is both just and feasible, even in these dark times.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Omar. I think so. I'm just wondering whether to let Omar first. Perhaps maybe you can take a few minutes to respond to some of the core issues, and then maybe we'll collect a few questions from everyone else.
Great. Thanks very much. I mean, thanks, first of all, Michelle, for your incredibly thoughtful and also generous reading of both the proposal and the both emotional and intellectual foundation for it. I really, really appreciate it. I'm going to respond a little bit out of order to what you've just set out, and start by talking about where Palestinians are and the challenge that presents. You and I spoke a little in the lobby of the building about the incredible difficulty right now of engaging with many Palestinians about a vision like this. For some, discussing Jewish attachment to all of Israel-Palestine and Jewish self-determination in Palestine is really hard in this moment. For some, the enterprise of partnership in a moment like this, while genocide is unfolding, feels inconceivable. And so the feelings that you're pointing to are real. And it's difficult for me to get a sense of how deep and how pervasive they are. My anecdotal experience is that they are not uniform in their depth or pervasiveness. I'll give you one anecdote that to me is pretty telling, maybe two, if I may. The first is that my Arabic tutor, who is a Palestinian woman who until February of 2024 was based in Gaza, lived in Gaza, she was born there, lived all of her life there, had only left the Gaza Strip once before she left in February 2024 because she was 3 weeks from delivering her child and was able to muster the $21,000 US that was needed to bribe Egyptian security officials so that she and her husband could actually escape their predicament, a predicament in which she had almost died 4 times. And actually, my colleague Mira Sukharov and I are in the middle of working on a book, and Sarah, this is the name of our Arabic teacher, her whole journey is recounted there, as well as the one of her kibbutz family that lives in a kibbutz that's in what's called the Gaza envelope. Anyway, that's a different point. But what was striking is that Sarah, in conversations with us, and this is a deeply religious and I think in many respects kind of typical person. She's not an outlier based on my knowledge of Palestinians. Her first reaction, of course, over the course of our conversations was rage and coming back to this phrase that I hear many Palestinians saying: we will never forget and we will never forgive. And her first reaction was also when Mira, who is Jewish, and I suggested that we asked her if her idea of what peace might look like had changed. She said, "Yes, it's impossible," and that was something she said emphatically. A month later, she wrote us back and said, "I've been thinking about it, and I don't think it's impossible. I think it's really hard, and I want to talk to you about it." And we had this heartrending conversation with her about her emotional struggles inside to sort of reconcile herself to what it means, what it would mean to make peace. But what was striking was that through all of it, she had her attitude toward Mira, again, who is Jewish, hadn't changed one iota. And all of this pointed to me to the extraordinary potential that is there for people to move past even the most horrific trauma. But in order to be realized, that potential needs to be the potential in order to be realized needs to be presented with the right circumstances. And so the question becomes, what do you need to put in place in order for Palestinians to be able to move forward with Israelis on a path of this kind? And I think one of the most important parts is that we need an end point. We need initially for the international community to be absolutely crystal clear about what any process that we are embarking upon will conclude with, but also eventually for Israelis and Palestinians to agree on that endpoint. One of the most destructive aspects of the Oslo process was the fact that we never agreed on where the process was heading. And so it was very easy for opponents of it to say it is heading in a really dangerous direction. And so I think that there are other things that can help beyond defining an endpoint. The kind of infusion of both temporary protection, the combination of protection, real protection for folks that can only be provided through international forces, more on that in a second, a really significant investment, not in a Gaza Riviera, but in a real transformation in conditions of life there. And I think ultimately it will be necessary for there to be a reckoning in Israel, I think, for Palestinians to feel able to forgive. And I think that that is really hard to achieve. But I'm reminded of something that I think was really a keen insight. The former Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad gave a talk at my law school some years ago, and he was asked about what Israel was calling the separation fence, and Palestinians called the apartheid wall running through the West Bank. And he said, in English, you say absence makes the heart grow fonder. He said, but in Arabic, we don't say the same thing. We say, far from the eyes, far from the heart. And he said, we understand human beings better than you. English speakers do, because separation actually hardens people. It facilitates dehumanization. And so, to my mind, what would be really crucial is a gradual process in which we don't have folks separated forcibly from one another to the extent that that's possible, but where their interactions are structured in ways that provide protection to both of them. That's not outside of reach, but it does require a commitment that is really hard to achieve. I think to your other questions, and I think that it's going to be very hard to get to that point without two things. One of them is a moral reckoning in Israel. And the question that I struggle with, and I'd be interested in your reflections on, both you and Shiri, is to what extent that can happen as an externally driven process. To my mind, one of the real tragedies of the last 25 years is that the international community has consistently enabled some of the worst impulses in Israel by not pushing back. And it has chosen not to push back for a range of different reasons, some of which are about internal politics in the states in question, and some of which are about legacies of responsibility and guilt. But I think that has been a really destructive dynamic. And I think it's very difficult for me to see any aspect of what we have laid out working unless the international community is there to provide incentives to Israelis for change. And those incentives, in part, I think, can come in the form of the kinds of carrots that I pointed to earlier, transformed regional security architecture. But I think that it also requires drawing clear lines around and naming Israeli crimes. And I think we're far from that at this moment. And that brings me to the last point. I think we are facing a conundrum in that so much of what we argue for in A Land for All is built upon international engagement with this. As you pointed out, our security concept assumes that international third parties would be involved in one or in a number of different capacities. Our concept for a binational court or a transnational human rights court is one that assumes that there may be a need for international judges, though we know that there is a really tricky record in places like Bosnia with regard to that. With regard to conflict, dispute resolution mechanisms across the full array of issues and monitoring, what we've learned from Israeli-Palestinian past experience is that you need third parties as fact finders and sometimes as arbiters of what's fair. And so all of that is crucial, and we are moving, as you pointed out, into a period where confidence in third-party processes is lower than it's ever been before. The only ray of hope that I've got right now, and I never dreamt that I would associate the word hope with anything to do with the United Arab Emirates. But I think that what has happened that I didn't anticipate, I was an opponent of the Abraham Accords, the peace agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, because of my concern that it eliminated an incentive structure that I thought was really crucial for Israel to move in a different direction. And I, to a great extent, stand by that concern and that apprehension. But one thing that it's produced is a shift in Israelis' sense of what is possible in the region. And whereas when we were 25 years ago talking about how to construct an international peace implementation mission in Israel-Palestine to ensure that a peace agreement could actually work, our assumption was that the forces would be Italian Carabinieri and US Marines and lots of Scandinavians. And I think what's really striking is that now you hear from Israel an interest in Arab involvement. And that, I think, even in a climate where confidence in international institutions has declined, there is a little possibility for us finding our own solutions based upon some mutual interests. And so that's, one potential ray of hope, unless we move so far toward catastrophe that in the brave new world that's rebuilt, there's a new sense of urgency around international law and institutions. I hope the former is the case.
Thank you so much. Let's open for just collecting a few questions. And if you are joining us online and you would like to ask a question, just open your camera so we can see you. Otherwise, we can't note the question. So we can start here in the room. Are there any questions? I mean, I have plenty, so I'm happy to continue unless anyone...
Shiri, how much time do you have?
So we have about 5 more minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
But unless there are any, so sorry. Yeah.
I just have a question.
The people in the Zoom can hear
us. We've been talking about concern about the end of the established sort of international rules-based order and what that might mean. But some of the concepts you've been talking about also suggest that we might have an opportunity to create something that's different, because there's been, every order and every set of rules, the current one is, 70 or 80 years old. Things develop and change over time. So I'm just thinking, while there's a lot of despair about that collapse, whether or not there's sort of also hope that you can actually create something which is different, but also brings in those parties that have rejected the current order.
So this question is very ill-formed, but so it begins sort of pessimistically. So in the sort of mid-1940s, I think still when the Second World War was being fought, George Orwell wrote an essay in which he expressed confidence in the decency of the British people, including that therefore they would accept the hit on their living conditions that would result from justice for India. And it turns out he was wrong, right? And so, and for me, that's where the error in his prediction, for me, connects closer to Michelle, to what you said about sort of the response of kind of basically non-European, non-North American parts of the world to what's happening in Gaza. And what you described certainly fits very much with my anecdotally formed impression. And so that sort of kind of makes sort of pessimistic. But what you said about the possibility of Israel responding to Arab participation, say in peacekeeping, and some changes in the sort of regional dynamics was optimistic in kind of the same space of thinking about sort of whose cultures or whose politics are the guiding dominant ones. So I guess the question is, like, can you either of you say just a little bit more about that? Is there a pathway to peace that doesn't require us to regard Europe and North America as the centres of power and moral judgment and control of the process?
Thanks very much to both presenters, both very lucid, very thought-provoking, although somewhat pessimistic. My comments actually do follow on from Patrick's. Yes, particularly to Omar to say more about the United Arab Emirates and their importance. So that's something, as an outsider, I'm not familiar with, so I would appreciate further explanation of that. And also just this, I don't know, I guess we can also describe it as this post-Trump moment that we're living in terms of the geopolitical circumstance of I beg your pardon? Post him coming to power, and yes, but yes, we're living it. And that seems to have, there's ironically some optimistic side to that, because it has taken a lot of the kind of control, I think, away from outside states such as the US, perhaps even Western Europe, and back on the actors themselves. So it seems to me, I mean, that's inherently almost the only way for a real solution is for the actors themselves to come and to find a solution. So that's kind of a question, kind of a comment. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason and Patrick and Mark, for the questions. I'll just add one kind of sentence to that before we have, maybe quick responses, and then we can continue over lunch, because we have lunch outside that will be waiting for us, and we can continue the conversation there. But I wanted to respond quickly to I think an idea that we all share about the power of the status quo and how difficult it is to move away from the status quo, especially considering the changes within Israeli society and possibly also within the Palestinian society as well. And I think this really indeed, so what I found is particularly concerning is that, and I remember myself as a 12-year-old kind of being very politically active, supporting the Oslo process. I think, so we are so far away from that moment where we had enough population on both sides that that has this vision of transferring the status quo into something better, that we're now in a moment where the kind of change from the status quo, that at least within Israel, is a change towards ethnic cleansing. So towards the idea that the only solution or the only way forward is to completely, erase the Palestinian from this region as a solution we can discuss. And to me, this is, obviously, ethically and morally appalling and concerning, but also it means something about the type of movement that can be done on the other direction and its feasibility. And I think, to me, it's always been, strange that, the Jewish Israelis who accepted as inevitable the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, Palestine, after thousands of years, after war, and demolished their residences, expelled them to different parts of the world, and for thousands and thousands of years, this was remain homeland, and ultimately, indeed, saw the return of Jewish people to Palestine and the establishment of Israel. And at the same time, can envision a situation where Palestinians who are, still residing in this homeland would be expelled, and that would be the end of it, is, to me, a way to kind of think about this duality in the current Israeli narrative, and perhaps some of the way to, maybe try to reverse that process. So I'll let each of you, think about how you want to respond, or even just to end your message, and then we can continue the conversation over the lunch outside.
Thank you for all those questions, very thoughtful and thought-provoking. I'm just mindful of time, so I'll just say something that kind of touches on a few of them, and goes to Patrick's question about a pathway. I think, and A Land for All really brings this out, but I think in some way it has to be looking at different pathways rather than one pathway. In my practical work, working at the intergovernmental, governmental, NGO level on this conflict for many years, the response from all sides was always, there's nothing we can do, it has to come from the international community. everyone knew we were heading towards disaster, but it was always that the international community is going to step in. And I feel like that has changed in some way after what's gone on for the last 16 months. They didn't step in, and this has unfolded. So I think it involves a rethinking and this kind of reliance that someone else is going to step in and fix things, an external actor. Again, I'm reticent to predict because I really do think we don't know what's going to happen with Trump. Like, it could go either way. But so it's hard to know whether there can be that shift in terms of power balance and whether it is going to be the external influence is going to continue as it was. But I do think that Omar raises a really good point about the UAE and not to underestimate the role that that can play in terms of contributing to the dynamic and as an additional pathway. And another pathway has to be from, I think, civil society. I can speak more about Israeli society that I know a bit about, not as someone currently living there, but you know, there are voices, a tiny minority, I will admit, but they do exist. And I think, and you know, quite a few of them are on the board of A Land for All. Some of them were living in those communities, you know, like Avi Dabush on October 7th, and they're fighting to have this kind of alternative. And you know, it's really important to listen to those voices and try and make them heard, and just hope that somehow they'll, you know, gain numbers and traction and make some kind of a change.
There's so much to say, but I'll just maybe end with one thing. I have a good friend who runs an organization called the European Institute of Peace, and they do a lot of facilitation of kind of mediation, really, facilitation of conversation between governments around conflict questions. And they have had a forum on the Gulf for some years, in which is one of the rare forums in which the Iranians and the other Gulf states actually sit down together. And the terms of reference for years was that they could talk about anything other than Palestine. And after October 7th, apparently they found it difficult to talk about anything other than Palestine. And there were, what my friend was telling me that I thought was especially striking was, first, that among these folks participating in this, and these were all leading officials in government, sort of second and third from head of state, right? So not foreign ministers, but one step down. And he said, to the one, these people, almost all of whom were trained in the West, had become completely disenchanted with the West as an idea, and completely disgusted with the idea that the West had anything to tell them anymore about what was moral or right. And so this real sense that of the consequences of hypocrisy, but that combined with a sense that there was a need for them to step up. And I haven't seen any evidence that they have at this juncture. I know that there is a plan underway to try to actually formulate what a vision for Gaza might be and to press it forward. And I gather that there is a real seriousness there. But I think what's so hard about the situation that we're in is that I think there is an appetite that we see in all of these contexts in the Arab world, among Trump supporters on Twitter, among far left apologists for Putin. There is an abiding critique of the order as it is, and a desire for a shift, and that could bring a shift. You know, I think there's this possibility, but I don't know what happens to liberal values. And like, as much as I feel glad that the UAE is making Israelis think Arabs are worth talking to. I'm also worried about the fact that it's hard for me to imagine to think of a more unequal society than that one. And so I leave you with this incredibly unsatisfying response to your questions, which is that it's a fraught moment full of possibilities that I don't think we had before, but that's for better and for worse.
Thank you so much. And I'll just end by saying that, I think throughout the years, I've always found your optimism sort of catching. And I know this is a very dark time, so even being like half hopeful is still, I think, a lot to go on. And I do think we absolutely need to not give up on that hope and on that even small slot of optimism to empower us to still go on and still fight for a better future for everyone. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us online. Thanks to everyone who joined us here today. Please join me in thanking our guest speakers today. Thank you. Everyone invited to join us live for lunch. Thank you.